talk, I guess. It's a real pleasure to introduce Barbara Tillman. She's from CNRS. She's a research director in Dijon. Just moved from Lyon to Dijon. She's also an adjunct faculty member at the University of Western Sydney in Australia. I would say she's one of the foremost researchers in the field of music cognition. Over 160 research articles, 3 books, and 28 book chapters, so she's been highly influential. She's been awarded many distinctions, including both the bronze and silver medals from CNRS, also the silver medal of the Academic Society Insurance Arts Science Medals. I've known Barbara for decades, I guess, at this point. I had the pleasure of spending part of my sabbatical with her in her lab at that time in Lyon. It was, 7 years ago, I think, and I had a great time. She's very interactive, highly intelligent, can talk on lots of interesting topics, and so while she's here, take advantage of talking with her because it will be a good experience. I should also say she's very active in science outreach, so she does many public lectures. She's worked with school children, arts organizations, and I know she's currently working on a documentary with the well-known French art station Art, and so we're really looking forward to seeing that when it comes out. In terms of her research, she's worked in a lot of different areas. Expectation and priming related to pitch and harmonic structures in music, a lot of work on music and memory. She's done some seminal work on relations between music and language, work on implicit memory, implicit learning. She's also done, I guess more recently, a lot of work on rhythm, perception rhythm, how rhythm is processed in the brain, and particularly deficits in rhythm perception and how they relate to dyslexia. I'm just going to take this opportunity also to mention that Barbara will be speaking on Saturday at our 18th, I can't believe it's our 18th, but it's our 18th annual Neuromusic conference held here in the Psychology Building. So please, if you haven't already signed up and come. It'll be a great day. The theme this year is developmental disorders and music. So we have a great lineup of speakers working on dyslexia, autism, stuttering, and also the genetic origins of rhythm processing. So I think that's it. So thanks for coming all this way, Barbara, and we're looking forward to it.
Thanks very much, Laura, for this kind introduction and in general for the invitation. I'm very happy and I can say excited to be here, discover all the work you're doing here, and for the opportunity for today, what I propose Laura is to present an overview of some of our research on congenital amnesia, and in particular focusing on short-term memory and how far we can use congenital amnesia to also better understand normal functioning, in addition to understanding this phenomenon of congenital amnesia. So congenital amnesia has had different terms. Some of you might have heard about it, such as tone deafness or tune deafness or amelodia or dysmelodia. But the idea is that it's a phenomenon that is known for a long time, since the 19th century, but it has developed as a research domain since about 20 years now, mainly thanks to the work of Isabelle Perret, who proposed the testing battery that I will present here slightly a bit later on. And so it has developed, and different research teams have addressed this phenomenon. So what is it? So it's a music processing deficit that cannot be explained by brain lesions, auditory deficits, or other cognitive, attentional, or social deficits. In general, it's important that these individuals have a normal understanding of speech, except if pitch comes into play, and normal recognition of voices and environmental sounds, and they report difficulties in recognizing familiar melodies when there are not the lyrics there. And one characteristic phenomenon is that they're unable to, or have difficulties to detect when someone sings out of tune, including themselves, or to detect an out of key or mistuned tone. So it's impaired music production and music perception. And the estimation was first about perhaps 4% of the population, and more recent estimates was 1 or 1.5% of the population. The estimation is actually difficult because you have to admit that you don't like music or that you have difficulties understanding music. But the estimation is around this percentage, and it has to be distinguished from the phenomenon of the bad singer, as it has been termed in the research domain, which is much more frequent. Because these bad singers, they are only having difficulties in music production, so in the singing, but they hear perfectly well when someone else sings out of tune themselves, or when it's a piano playing out of tune. And it has also been to distinguished from the phenomenon of some part of the general population of non-musicians who have just a missing confidence in their actual music perception or musical singing capacity. So it's a different phenomenon where you can document the impaired music perception or production, which is not the case for the non-musician who has missing confidence, but once you test them, or when you tested even the singing production as we did in Montreal, you can actually see how sophisticated the music perception or the musical knowledge about the structure of the tonal system is. And that's part of the work I've done before, and Laura was before. So we have impaired music perception and production, and synth pitch is a form-bearing dimension of Western tonal music. And again, well, we have this cultural side comment that it's mainly about Western tonal congenital music and Western tonal music, so we can come back to this if you want. So the hypothesis is this impaired pitch processing. And the phenomenon is interesting and because it's described as a developmental disorder of neurogenetic origin. So it has been compared to developmental dyslexia for language or congenital prosopagnosia for faces, with similar estimates of occurrence in the population. And it's this kind of disorder that also gives us some insight into behavioral, neural, and genetic basis of cognitive function, what is here music cognition. And then obviously also the influence of environment on this phenomenon. So to be considered as a music, Isabel Peretz has proposed a battery of evaluation that has then been used like a neuropsychological test battery. So individuals must perform inferior to 2 standard deviations from the mean performance of the population of musically intact controls. And then their music perception production or language perception production and so on as further studies. So this battery has 6 tests to evaluate perceptual memory of music, and the construction is always the same except for one. So you hear a melody, there's a delay, you have a second melody, and you have to say whether they're the same or different. So it's actually a short-term memory task, at least for the 5 of the subtests. And the change is either that it introduces an out-of-key tone, so that does not fit at all, and I can present this to make you listen, or more fine-grained changes, so there's a change of the interval, or change of the contour, or change of resonance. And then there's an incidental memory test, and the meter test where you have to say it's either duple or triple. But I won't speak about the time dimension today, but focus really on the pitch dimension and particularly memory. So melody 1, delay, and then so you have this out-of-key tone, and this is part of the battery that's the most diagnostic, where the musics have difficulties to actually detect that the second melody was different from the first. So is it impaired pitch discrimination and or impaired pitch memory? So impaired pitch discrimination, so isolated from the music side, Heid and Peretz had proposed a task that's just a pitch change direction task, a detection task. So you have 5 identical tones, so the 4th one is changed up or down. You have to say was there a change or not. They used fixed changes, so more recently we used it as an adaptive, more psychoacoustic or psychophysical implementation, and we confirmed that there's a deficit, so the overall threshold of the music is higher than the controls, that I need more distance between the 2 pitches to actually say there was a change. And I come back to the overlap that you see in the picture in a second. So So the congenital amusics is not limited to an impaired encoding or processing of musical material, but can be highly complex. But even if you strip it down to just a simple pitch discrimination task, you can see that there's a deficit with higher pitch discrimination threshold. So that's pitch discrimination. So if you have, like in the battery task, the same different task, well, how far does it then influence the pitch memory, or how enhanced is the deficit? So here we did a series of studies, and it's a paradigm that is similar to what you have just heard for the battery, but stripped down to just simple tone sequences like here. Okay, but it could vary more or less long. And you have to say, well, same or different, but it's obviously different here with the contraviolation, so pretty easy to do. So if you test this with the amusics, you see that the overall performance with the red square is below the controls, but the best of the amusics is way below the performance of the best of the controls. So if you have this type of result, well, you can say, well, are these memory difficulties due to the pitch perception difficulties, which means if I don't perceive the difference between the different tones that are lined into a melody, well, then if I have to do a memory task on it, then obviously I will be badly performing because I didn't hear it in the first place. So our idea was then, what then has been done afterwards too, is to construct musical material for the memory task with pitch differences that are adapted to the pitch discrimination threshold of the individual music participant. So here we use the classical psychoacoustic pitch difference detection threshold measure, so adaptive, and then we use this information. Well, with this information we found again that there's impaired pitch discrimination for the amusics as a whole. If you compare the red square, so higher up is increased threshold, so worse performance, so you need more difference in order to say where the difference was. But you see again the overlap between the two groups. But you use this information of the individual impaired pitch discrimination thresholds of the amusics to define the melodies, and then only use differences that are above the individual threshold. So if we do this and we run again the short-term memory task, well, the group is below and the worst of the controls is better than the best of the amusics. And so that with the pitch memory task, you don't see the overlap between the groups. So if we put this together, I think that we have impaired pitch discrimination, but there's overlap between the group. As soon as memory kicks in, the two groups become to distinguish more strongly, okay? So even when it's above the threshold, or even if you consider memory performance for amusics who have a pitch discrimination threshold in the normal range, when memory kicks in, they are impaired. And that fits with the non-overlap that you can observe in the battery that I presented at the very beginning. Okay. So if you say impaired pitch memory, you can then look at other features that have been described for short-term memory in general for other types of material. And then you see that for the congenital amusics, for example, the effect of the delay is disastrously destroying more strongly the performance than for the control group. So they have more difficulty in retaining pitch over time. Another phenomenon that's described in short-term memory literature that you might know from other materials is the effect of interference. So if in the delay you put other material in, then there's greater destruction of the memory trace for the amusics than for the controls. Another element that you can investigate then for the short-term memory for the pitch material for the amusics is whether you can actually have better performance if there's structure in the material. And I come back to this a bit later. For now, I want to ask rather the question, well, is it specific to pitch, or is it for auditory information in general? So here we just took the simple task that I have shown you before, same different, and we implemented in the same way with short French monosyllabic words that are all pronounced on the same pitch height, so that's not the cue to make the task. Then it's the same stream of syllables or different, and also musical terms. So we did not expect deficit in the word short-term memory, if it's specific to music, that deficit. If the memory is restricted to pitch, the timbre performance should be okay, but if it's more general and non-verbal short-term memory deficits, then we should also observe a deficit in the timbres, in particular if it's the spectral pitch height that might be. And that's what we observe. We have an impaired short-term memory for pitch. That's the first, what replicates what I've shown you before. For words, there's no significant difference between the groups. In chamber, it's significantly different, but it's not as bad as for the pitch sequence. And that the verbal short-term memory is unimpaired also fits with the observation that there are musics when we test them with a normal digit span measure, but either forward or backward. There's no difference with the controls, either for our musics or from other groups who have worked on it. So the central phenomenon that would be the hypothesis now is, so well, there's an impaired pitch memory. So what might be the underlying neural correlates that would reflect this anomaly, but not only for pitch, but not for the verbal material. So let me come back to my definition at the very beginning, right? I said there's no brain lesions in these individuals affected by this phenomenon. So what is going wrong in this music brain? Okay, no lesions, but what I will show you now as a first overview, before going to functional memory data, is there have been brain anomalies that have been reported. And if we focus on pitch, we can look at very old data that the Robert Sartorius group has reported with a PET study. So you see the old picture from the 90s. We're showing that the right inferior frontal cortex together with the right temporal regions are relevant for pitch processing, and the inferior, in particular, pitch memory kicks in. And now with our music, you can see that these data sets fit with the normal functioning that had been initially reported. So the first studies looked at structural anomaly along this right frontal temporal pathway, what was the hypothesis. So Krista Hyde and Isabel Peretz at the very beginning looked at white matter concentration and observed decreased white matter in the right inferior frontal cortex. And then with a different measure, the first one was VDM, and then cortical thickness analysis, they confirmed the anomaly in inferior frontal regions, again the right inferior frontal, but also in the superior temporal cortex. With the data that suggests that there's this decreased white matter and also some increases in gray matter in the right inferior regions of the musics observed in other studies, with the idea that it might be that the communication between the two, and sending the information from temporal region and inferior frontal and back might be. And this then had been supported as the hypothesis with the observation that there's a reduction of the fibers in the right arcuate fasciculus on the right side, so the conductivity between the temporal and the frontal cortex in the music group in comparison to the control. And the discussion was that it might be related to some malformation in the cortical development, or a lack of normal neural pruning during the development, or abnormal migration, as it has been also reported in dyslexia, that then makes that you have the abnormalities observed in the inferior frontal cortex and the temporal cortex, and that gets connection. Okay, so that was the structure. What can we see on the functional side? Okay, so the first results that have been just passive listener. Okay, so you don't have a task that kicks in. They presented pitch material. This was with pitch changes, or there's a fixed pitch sequence as a first approach, and they also observed anomalies in right inferior frontal cortex with decreased activation for their musics in comparison to the controls. And in addition, they made functional connectivity analysis, and for their music, they showed decreased connectivity between the right auditory cortex and the inferior frontal gyrus, and increased connectivity between the two auditory cortices for their musics in comparison to the controls. So two levels of misfunctioning, but no deficit in the auditory cortex itself. No deficit in the auditory cortex itself we have observed also in the study when some Norman didn't come analyze our data in active perception tasks. So here we have material that changed a lot in the harmonic tones and then have much noise in comparison. See, well, what is with the harmonic tones, where the pitch dimension is important in comparison to their music. And so we did a set of analyses on pitch responsive regions in the auditory cortex, and here we didn't see any difference between the musics and the controls. Okay? In extent, selectivity, and anatomical location, it seems that the auditory cortex is not responsible for the deficits that we have observed with the music. Okay? And even if we just select the musics who have increased pitch discrimination thresholds, same result, no difference between the controls and them. That is the analysis we did big then. More recently, with Philip Albuy, we reanalyzed this data with a whole brain multivariate pattern analysis. And here we could distinguish. Here we could distinguish the musics from the controls. That's the pattern of the functional activity. I'm sorry, I forgot the microphone. Does this work in the same way as before? Sorry. So we used the multivariate pattern analysis and then had this classifier that was able then to say that's an musical multi control thanks to a more global analysis using the patterns in the right hash of strings. So we have functional anomalies also then in the right or starting in the auditory cortex, and here was just a passive listening task. What is with the functional anomalies when we put the task, when we look at the neural correlates with the task, that is the center of the deficit, so the impaired pitch memory. What we did then in the next step, and we used MEG where we have the temporal information and the spatial information, and we used the same type of different tasks as I presented before, but for the purpose of the study we used two different levels. So we had the melody control task, which is the difficult task where we thought the musics will be impaired, or then the transposition task where everything would just transpose up or down, and so it's an easy task where you have to say it's different. I think I don't have to play it to you, you can imagine that it's much more. And the behavioral results confirmed what we had before, so we have a clear deficit for the musics here with the red dots for the control tasks in comparison to the controls, but not for the easy transposition task where everything is shifted. So measuring the MEG signal allowed us then to look at encoding, retention, and retrieval. And if we start with the tone 1 during the encoding phase, for the P50 we didn't see a difference between the groups. However, when we go further in time, so for the N100, we already observed an increased latency in bilateral IFG for the musics in comparison to the controls. And here it was a memory task. So we could say, well, they encoded knowing that they have to do something with it. They have to memorize it up in order to do the task. But these early differences, we have run another data set now that we started to analyze this, where they just hear isolated tones, so they don't have to do a task on it. It's just perceiving the tone with big time intervals between them. And even here we see an anomaly for the musics in comparison to the control. So we have a decreased amplitude of this N100 for these isolated tones, even if there's not a memory task. So it's really the encoding phase, even if there's no memory task that's coming up, that has an iteration and impairment for them. So we have tone 1, and then we looked at the other tones, tone 2 to 6 of the melody, and looked at the N100. And here, for the musics, always in comparison to the controls, we see a decreased amplitude of the N100 and an increased latency. If we do this with the source localization, you see again that it's the inferior frontal gyrus and the superior temporal gyrus that is involved in this alteration or anomaly for the musics during this encoding phase. We then also looked at the dynamic causal modeling and observed that it's the decreased backward connectivity between the right inferior frontal cortex to the right auditory cortex for the musics in comparison to the controls. And again, an increased lateral connectivity between the two auditory cortices for the musics in comparison to the controls. So this is in line with the fMRI study with passive listening, Mr. Hyde I just presented before, as shown. And now in addition, we see that there's an intrinsic modulation in both auditory cortices that is decreased for the musics in comparison to the control. So there is the encoding phase. Let me jump now to the retrieval. I come back to the retention phase afterwards. So in the retrieval phase, again, the retrieval, we have either the same melody or one of the tones is different. So you can look at the difference wave between the second melody that's the same or the difference, and then compare the musics against the controls. And again, we see an alteration in the connectivity between the right auditory cortex and the right inferior frontal cortex. Here, the forward connectivity, how the signal is sent to the IFG. Effective connectivity is altered within and between the two auditory cortices again. So if you put the summary of this MEG study together, you see converging evidence with what the structural data has shown before. This frontotemporal network being less functional or less recruited in comparison to the controls during the encoding phase and the retrieval. So here we tapped directly into the task that was the deficit for the musics, this pitch short-term memory task. Then the question came up, can we observe this type of anomaly also without a task and even without the music? Okay? So you anticipate that I will show you resting state data. And then the second question, obviously, is it really specific to the tones, as the behavioral data suggests? What is with the neural correlates for the verbal short-term memory? So for the first question, is there functional anomaly at rest? Well, obviously you can follow me saying that the aim is to see whether the potential differences might be due to differences in strategies for the music in comparison to the controls. Listening strategies or approaching the task for the short-term memory that then creates the differences in functional activity that we observe. Or is it motivation or attention related, voluntary or involuntary, compensatory mechanisms? So we just looked then at the resting state activity, and we used left and right Hashimoto's as the seed region that we functionally defined from the MEG study I just presented you before and an fMRI study that I will present you afterwards. And then we looked what is the connectivity in the music brain in comparison to the control. So we observed decreased frontotemporal connectivity again in the musics in comparison to the controls. Again, we saw this increased connectivity with the contralateral auditory cortex for the musics in comparison to the controls. And what was interesting, what came out in this resting state recording is that we also see for the musics an increased connectivity with the default mode network areas. So as if the music auditory cortex is more strongly turned toward the internal processing, or phrased differently, less available to an in-depth processing of this external material that comes in, so the sounds that are presented in comparison to the controls. And again, one could make the hypothesis that this could reflect an immature state of the system. When you tie it back with other data that have been reported, that over development, normally the connectivity strength between the executive network and the default mode network during resting state has been shown to decrease with age over adolescence. So that would suggest that this over-connectivity between the executive network and the DMN could reflect an immature state of the system that we then observe here for them. So I asked the two questions: can we see it at rest, so without musical input? And is it specific to the tones? So here we used again short-term memory task. I presented the fMRI data. We now have MEG data under analysis, so stay tuned. But here it's the short-term memory task will be implemented very simple, just with 3 items. So it's 3 items to be encoded, a long maintenance phase because we want to look at the brain activity during the maintenance phase. And then it's either the same 3 or altered, the task is again the same. Or then you have syllables as the comparison task. And we also used as the comparison condition for this fMRI task, we use a perception task. So they knew that now is a block with just perception task, or whatever it's labeled. So they hear the first melody, the delay, they don't have to do anything, they have to wait for the second one and compare the last 2 items whether they're the same or not. Okay? which for us allows us to analyze what the brain is doing more for the first melody when they have to encode it for the memory task in comparison to just hearing it, and also for the maintenance. What is particularly interesting, the maintenance period, because there's no signal that is coming in, they just maintain either the verbal or the tonal material in memory, and we can see what the music brain is doing in comparison to the control brain. So for the behavioral data, we get exactly what we had expected. So we have a deficit for the tonal material, for both the memory task and for the perception task, because even if you have to wait for the end of the second melody, well, you have to compare two events on the pitch dimension, which is difficult. You need the memory trace from the first tone, and so they are paired in comparison to the controls. However, if the same tasks, memory and perception, are implemented with verbal material, no impairment for the music. So replicating the first simple behavioral study I have presented. I want to focus for the analysis, I want to present for the maintenance phase. I just want to show this result pattern for the encoding because it fits with what I've presented you before, except now it's with this other type of material and with the fMRI data. So you have the tone, what is the functional connectivity during the encoding when you compare the tone material memory task in comparison to the total perception task. So you have the same information, but once you know, you have to memorize it, and once you just wait that it's over. If you use the seat in superior-temporal gyrus, see again that on the right side there's a decreased connectivity with the inferior frontal gyrus for the amusics in comparison to the control. Okay, maintenance. So here we can look at verbal and tonal material, and we don't have the difficulty to say, well, what's with the difference in the acoustic input, because it's just silence. So when we look at the verbal material, well, we find kind of classical verbal short-term memory results. So you have the left inferior frontal gyrus that is more activated in the memory task in comparison to the perception task, and you can see it also in the correlations. The higher the memory performance, the more is the activity in the IFG, or the other way around. And we also see the left frontal temporal connectivity when you compare the verbal memory in comparison to the perception with a seat in the temporal cortex, and then with the IFG activation connectivity enhanced with the IFG, for the memory task in comparison to the perception task. And what is the interesting point here is there's no group differences. So for all the results that I report you for the maintenance for the verbal material, it's the same for the amusics and for the controls. Okay? If we now look at the maintenance task for the tonal material, now again we see the difference for the amusics. For example, so again it's a comparison maintenance phase for memory task in comparison to the perception task, for the amusics in comparison to the controls, and you see for the amusics it's decreased activity in the right inferior frontal gyrus and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the right temporal regions, and also a bit on the left side. And the amusics show in addition increased activity in the auditory regions. So you can tie this also with the behavioral data as I did before. So if you look at the right inferior frontal gyrus, the activation, you see that for the controls it correlates positively with the memory performance. So it's kind of the mirror image from what I just showed you for the verbal material. The more it's activated, the better is the performance. The amusics don't show this. However, the amusics show a negative correlation between the left superior temporal gyrus activity and memory performance. So amusics recruit for this tonal maintenance a cortical network involving mainly the sensory regions, and as you can see, it's not very efficient, leading them to have worse performance than the And then you can also look again at the connectivity analysis, and it's decreased connectivity between the right inferior frontal gyrus and the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And this is interesting. So we see it for the controls, with increased connectivity between the inferior frontal gyrus and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex for memory maintenance in comparison to the perception delay. What is a result that has been reported previously of for the controls, but for the music, it's decreased this connectivity between the two. And this result pattern can be tied to two other observations. In the MEG study I just presented you before, we had observed during the delay for the controls a gamma band activity in the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex during this maintenance delay in the melodic contour task for the controls, but not for the music. So it points to the involvement for the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex when doing this more difficult task. Okay? I want to tie it also to a study that Charlotte al has done, the other way around. So they, based on our gamma activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex for the controls, in comparison to their music, they stimulated with transcranial alternating current stimulation the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex during the tonal maintenance, and they improved the pitch memory performance of the musics in comparison to the sham stimulation. And we can also tie it to another type of study that Isabel Perez has done. They use TDCS, and they to stimulate overfrontal regions to create an amusic behavioral data pattern from normal controls. Okay? So some conversion evidence for this network, and for us, well, it's their music showing this anomaly in, again, the frontal temporal and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, that helps out. So if I put together what I just presented, so we have this impaired pitch perception, yes, but even in music where you don't have impaired pitch perception, well, you have impaired pitch memory. And you can observe structural and functional anomaly along the frontotemporal pathway, as I showed you, with different methods and different paradigms and different approaches that convergently show this alteration. So we have seen for the music delayed and reduced frontal and temporal responses, and this decreased connectivity between this frontal temporal network for the music in comparison. And in contrast to the decreased connectivity, we have this increased connectivity with the contralateral temporal regions in the music in comparison to the controls, which together with the N100 altered response showed that even with, without the memory step, there's already a deficit in the low-level encoding of the tones for the music in comparison to the controls. So it's starting early in the process that something is impaired for the music and not just in higher-level representational steps kicking. So based on all this, we were wondering, can one boost the encoding of the pitch information for the music with increasing the time, adding audiovisual interactions, and can we use this then as a training program? So that's what I want to briefly present you now with a sneak preview of this training study that just finished. So the idea was boosting encoding of pitch information with increased time. So we used also a short-term memory paradigm here, and we manipulate either tone duration and or the interstimulus interval between the two tones, wondering whether if you give the system that has difficulty in encoding the tone information and creating this memory trace more time and or more information, perhaps this decreases the observed difference. And that's what we observe. So here you have this short-term memory task just with a single tone, so you have beep, pause, beep, same or different. And the difference between left and right here is the duration of the tones that are presented. So it's either just 100 milliseconds or 350, and we have the controls on the top with better performance, obviously, than their music. But you can see in their music there's an increase in performance when you increase the length of the tones involved in the short-term memory task. Okay. And you can, and this also holds if you use similar manipulations for 4-tone sequences. So for now, let's just look at the two extremes. So either you have 4 tones that are played very rapidly, 100 milliseconds without intertone interval, or then slower, longer tones with a delay in between. For the fast tempo, you see the music is clearly impaired in comparison to the controls, but if you give the system more time during the encoding and before putting in the next information, performance reaches the performance level of the controls. So when there's enough time given to encode the pitch information, the musics are able to reach the normal performance in both of the tasks. And the music's pitch processing benefit from the long durations and by extension on the other side, the slower rate of the presentation of the tones. Can't explain obviously everything, because you can say, well, it's also in the range, or if you play it slower, like at the very first task that I presented was 500 milliseconds, there still there are more notes or fine-grained changes and so on. But if you keep all conditions the same and you increase the length or give more time, the trace is better and the performance is better. And the second idea to boost pitch encoding that we wanted to use is audio tapping into the boost thanks to visual information that is synchronized with the auditory information. So here we used not a memory task. That's now the next idea to be implemented and tested. But it's just a pitch deviance detection task. So it's the one that I presented at the very beginning. So I have 5 tones, they're all identical, or the fourth one is shifted up or down. But in this time, it's not only the sound, but when a tone appears, you have a round disk appearing on the screen at the same time, but it's not informative, right? So there's change or not, it's always the same visual information. But it's the binding between the two information that allowed to boost the performance in the pitch detection task. When it was in the situation, I don't know, too difficult or too easy. So it's a bit the mirror image that my colleague Anka Klein used with people who are short-sighted, where they had to detect a threshold visual signal when she presented a non-affirmative tone at the same time. The visual perception was boosted thanks to this audio visual interaction. So the project that is now in progress, so now in analysis, is to use this audiovisual stimulation for a pitch processing training program. Our idea was to say, can we improve pitch encoding, and then observe changed neural correlates, and in particular observe changes in this frontotemporal network that has been observed to be impaired for them. So the idea of the project was to have a training program preceded by a test session and followed by a test session, obviously. And this training program was either targeting on this audiovisual pitch encoding, what I just presented, or then a visual spatial control task to have them also trained and do something, but not on the auditory image. And the test session were different tasks, the beginning and end, and also MEG data that we record with a typical oddball paradigm, so tracking for the MMN. And it's either, the deviant is either a big deviant, so it's a change of 2 semitones, or a little deviant, a quarter of a semitone. So for now, as you can see, I present you data just in preliminary, and the 9 in each group are combined, the music from the controls. Now we have the full data set, so stay tuned for the full analysis. But this is the first set that we analyze, so we see an MMN, and for whether it's audiovisual training or whether it's visual spatial training, when there's the big pitch deviance, well, that's the first session or the second session. What is interesting, obviously, is the little deviance. And here we had the encouraging data that we have an MMN that emerged after the audiovisual training that we didn't have in the first session and that we don't see in the visual training. So that's the first, pilot set analysis that now we hope to improve and put together when we look at it. Okay, so let me summarize what I presented and make another opening in the direction of understanding this phenomenon of congenital amusia, and perhaps in the direction of other ways to potentially exploit what they actually can be doing for potential training or rehabilitation programs. So I wanted to put together today and show you is that having this phenomenon and looking at it closer as an opportunity to increase our understanding of typical and pathological auditory network functioning, and in particular then short-term memory. So this focus obviously is the frontotemporal network here, involved in the pitch encoding phase, the maintenance and the retrieval, as we can separate nicely thanks to the simple short-term memory task. Sylvain Baillet in Montreal analyzed data on pitch detection of controls and musics from Isabelle Perret with Philippe Albou, who worked with us before. And they now target to look at this from an oscillatory perspective, okay, and see the impairment in the oscillatory communication, again between the frontotemporals. Another way to look at it from, in addition to the data I've presented to you before, where there's few oscillations, a new extension that the domain then can develop further. So this frontotemporal network and this anomalies that we observe, or they also observed, is the role of the frontotemporal connectivity deficit, or this abnormal frontal involvement, has led also to the hypothesis to say, well, perhaps for the musics, this might be also a potential disorder of consciousness. So they might process more than they actually can report, that they can report. And what can be seen when you look at indirect investigation methods that show that there's, even if there's impairment, there's more processing going on than is actually should be showable with explicit tasks. For example, if it's on pitch change detection, so EEG has revealed that even if the behavioral data didn't show the detection of the change, the EEG trace could reveal that their musics made the difference. But we can see this also with behavioral data, and here I want to present you briefly two studies that we have done using, for example, here the first one is a priming methodology. So our musics have a difficulty to detect an out-of-key tone. They have difficulties to judge tone structures if you ask directly. The priming paradigm is a way to indirectly investigate potential tonal knowledge, tonal structure perception in a population. We have tested it extensively with non-musicians, with children, or with other pathologies. And it's the priming paradigm is like what you have known from psycholinguistics. So you have a prime context, and it ends on the target chord, and you manipulate the relatedness of the target with the preceding context, whether it's semantics or syntactic in the language material. We do it based on the tonal structures. And so the 8 chords in the first sequence plays the role of the tonic, which is a highly important functional event in the Western tonal musical system, so it's strongly related and supposedly to be strongly expected, in comparison to the same acoustic event being less important in the second melody. So even if you have the same acoustic ending, thanks to the beginning that it starts a different key, you have different functions, and if a listener has tonal knowledge, the expectations for the ending of the sequence should be different, and the final chord should be expected in the first condition, because it's how the sequence should normally end. And so you can see this influence of the tonal expectations in the response times. Participants are faster in doing an unrelated task like detecting whether it's played with an instrument A or B, or whether it's sung on an E or an U. A bit like the lexical decision task in psycholinguistics. It's a word or non-word of the English language, and how semantic or syntactic relations influences. So you never ask the participants explicitly what do they think about the tonal structure, but you just look how the brain predicts and is influenced. And the general pattern that we observe is response times are faster in the first sequence than in the second sequence, even for non-musicians or young children. And we observe this also for the music. So you have the typical pattern for the controls. You also have it for the music, even if it is a bit less strong than for the controls. So the hypothesis is that even the musics have acquired some implicit musical knowledge, which might be perhaps sparser or more sparse than that of the controls. And they could have acquired this thanks to some implicit pitch processing, okay? or that some of the tone relations are above pitch discrimination threshold, and so they still understand some of the basic tonal structures, but allows them implicitly, if you're not asked to make explicit judgments on the tonal structures of the musical system. So we have the priming methods, but we can also ask another method, indirectly asking them to judge tonal material. And when we did the study, Zendel did a study on the EEG where the participants had either to detect an out of T tone or do the task just next to it. And when the task was directly on the deviant tone, their musics were impaired, but when the task was on something else, the brain signal actually showed that it detected the deviant tone. So it fitted with what we were just finished as a behavioral data that I want to show you now, what is not on just pitch difference, but on the tonal structure knowledge again. So we were wondering how far can we push the perception of tonality in their music. So we used piano accents. Instead of having our nice 4 or 6 tone melodies that are musically not that complex, we used original piano pieces from the repertoire, romantic or early 20s, and we rendered them atonal. So the pitch content was reorganized to remove the tonal relationship, so it's atonal, but kept as close as possible between the pitch in relation to the pitch content, the rhythm, tempo, dynamics. And we use this romantic and early 20s repertoire because there also we have naturally some not only consonant structure but also some dissonant features in it. So it's not just the difference between tone and atonal, it's this consonant dissonance. So let me just make you listen. Just to give you an idea of the material that you listen to, and then if you create the atonal clone, so you see the same. Okay, just to give you an idea about the similarity, that we really targeted the perception of the tonality. And our idea now is to ask 3 different questions to the music. So it's subjective judgments, okay, but they require judgments from different perspectives. So we have an explicit structural one, where we ask them, evaluate the degree the excerpt is in agreement with what we are used to hear about music in our culture. So it's explicitly targeting the tonal structure. The second one is more personal one. Evaluate the degree to which you would buy a CD with this kind of music. And then the last one is a more social one, judging the perspectives of the other. So imagine it's a hit parade in France. Where do you think the French population would place this piece? Top, mid, starting point. And what we observed is that music can, even for the first structural questions, that can make the difference between the tonal and the atonal material. But there's an interaction between group and tonality. So the difference is bigger for the controls than for their music. However, when we ask them not the explicit structural question, but we ask for the same material, the personal, emotional question, there's no interaction. It's the same pattern between our music and controls, and also if they have to judge where would it be on the hit parade. And in additional, so you have the same material, and depending on what you ask our music to judge, you can actually show that they perceive more than they give you in the response if it targets the dimension of an explicit evaluation. And an interesting result that we had in addition, obviously we analyzed all material from an acoustic point of view, so for roughness and dissonance, and then the tonal characteristic, tonal center, and tonal stability, and so on. And for the controls for all three tasks, for all three judgments, it was the tonal features that drove the response. For their music, this was also for question 2 and 3. So just like the controls, but when it was targeting on the explicit, it was the acoustic features and the roughness or the dissonance that drove the responses of their music. So that was the data set I want to show you that all point together to this, that there's tonal structure knowledge implicitly also in our music. So depending on how you investigate it or how you ask it might not reach level of consciousness in the same way than for the controls, but there's something in long-term memory stored about the tonal structure of the musical system of that culture. So if I know, as a last comment, to tie this back to what I presented during the whole talk about short-term memory, and I announced, can we use structure in the material to help short-term memory? Well, can we observe better short-term memory for tonal sequences in comparison to atonal sequences? So we do two types of implementation, a very simple one, 5-tone sequences where you can use just a tonal set, an atonal set. And here we saw that the musics are not improved in absolute memory performance, but the response times were faster for the tonal than the atonal, like for the controls. Then we did the study I just presented with a more complex tonal material where there are more tonal features and richer, and we have the tonal and atonal, for which we know that the musics, when they are not asked to judge them, can make the difference, and we use this in a short-term memory. And here we see that for this more complex musical piano excerpts, the musics show the same benefit for having a structure in the short-term material, also for the memory performance. So memory performances, they're all over impaired, but if there is structure in there that taps into a system knowledge that they have in long-term memory, there's also, so we can find, that's what I announced at the very beginning, a typical feature of memory performance. If there's structure in the material, well, memory performance is better than when it isn't. And just to mention a last comment, what we are exploring now is the link between liking and short-term memory. So we know that if material is liked, short-term memory performance is improved. And we just finished a study in Lyon. We used an implementation, as Glenn Schellenberg has shown, with non-musicians. So you have different full-blown pop rock music and participants judge them for liking. And then in the second phase of the experiment, you test for the memory performance. And they observed it for the non-musicians, and we observed it now they have non-musicians, so a widespread. And ours were clear non-musicians and their music, and we also see the benefit of this liking dimension on the short term, even if they are missing. So I want to thank various collaborators on the project, and in particular the Lyon team. So I mentioned Anka Klar and Phil Barbieu, as well as Johanna Lebeck, and other collaborators of different projects I've presented. I thank you for your attention. I just want to throw in postdoc positions we have in Dijon on an unrelated project that is in the domain that Laurel announced earlier. And I stop here, and I thank you for it. Well, it's postdoc position in Lyon, but it's a project that Sarah and I have with Laurel.
Questions?
Sure. Yeah, to, I guess, tap into a little bit of the rhythm stuff that you're hinting at. So in my understanding, the right superior temporal gyrus is more specific to pitch processing, and the left is a little bit more specialized for rhythmic processing. Do you think that like over connectivity between the right and the left in the A musics has like anything to do with more reliance on rhythmic or time-centered stuff rather than focusing on pitch and tonal content?
Well, I don't know, I don't have any data. I wouldn't go that far, and I don't think that we don't have to go that far for now. It's just that as you over-recruit in other areas in addition to, because there's a deficit. If it might, but it's an interesting comment that you say, because most of the music that's defined and recruited here, the deficit is on the pitch dimension. So when you look at the studies that they have done, Elizabeth Perez has done for the battery, or the more recently, is all the musics have a deficit on the pitch dimension, and then you have a part of it, half of it, that have also a deficit on the rhythm dimension. Not mentioning those where there might be only a deficit in beat processing or in rhythm processing. So it might be interesting to look into this overactivity or increased connectivity by separating their musics that are really only pitch and deficit, and then pitch and time, and then be able to respond to your question. Because you have those who are okay for the time, but not for the pitch and vice versa.
Yeah, Gabriel?
Yeah, thank you. Wonderful talk. So I'm just very, very curious about this particular population and the deficit. So I have two questions. So one is, I understand there's an effect called Bubakiki effect. Say, will just internally will represent high pitch sound versus with a very sharp image object, right? So it's very, kind of internal. Even in infants, you can see that. So I'm not sure. So for those population, what they have in deficit to make the association, association between pitch and other modality information representing other modality.
Like this task with association, well, obviously no one has done it. That's an interesting combination. I think it depends what's the pitch difference between if you have the E or the U.
Yeah.
Often these differences are quite large, no? What was one of the first hypotheses saying that, okay, they have a deficit in music but not in pitch, because if you look at pitch variations in the prosody, the differences are much bigger than in the music material. Except that then, I skipped all this historical part, but then when you do non-verbal analogs of a prosody sentence, and you don't have the verbal information anymore, then the musics also have a deficit if they don't have the verbal material anymore. But might be linked to hypothesis where to tuck in the information to give you an answer. Or another hypothesis is perhaps the calculation of the pitch differences in a verbal material has other features that can help the musics in comparison to, for the verbal material in comparison to the pitch. For example, we did this tone change detection task. We had it with a tonal material, and then with a syllable, so ka 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 ka. And there the musics were impaired, but they were less impaired than for the tone material. So in the calculation of the pitch height in the verbal material, other acoustic features kick in to help. But your idea is interesting, but I don't know what would happen if you do a sorting task like this.
Yeah, I was thinking maybe they might rely on other modality to compensate the deficit processing information.
Well, the thing is also that in natural spoken material, that you have other cues to help you. So, for example, there are studies now in our musics for tone language speakers, where you could say, well, their pitch is very important. Is ma, is it rising, falling, and so on. What happened is that the first studies looking at music tone language speakers, when you test with natural tone language material, they don't show any deficit. Because you have often what is if you have a pitch change in the tone material, you have other dimensions that co-vary. So if the intensity, there's the duration, and all these additional cues can then help to nevertheless in the tone language to understand what tone it is. If then they strip it down and use very controlled tone language material where you don't have these additional cues, well then performance drops.
Well, thank you. That actually was my second question.
Okay.
Whether you show any difficulty or challenging to learn a second language which is happen to the tone language.
Yeah.
So it's very nice. Thank you.
Maybe I'll ask a question. I was intrigued. I either forgot or never knew that study where you had the visual stimulus that actually wasn't giving any information about pitch, but it still seemed to help, which made me wonder. So I think most of the stimuli from most of the studies you described were isocronous, so they had a very strong rhythmic sort of pattern, and I wondered if they're actually having, maybe they don't have a large rhythm deficit as would show up on the battery for amusia, but maybe they have an attention problem, sort of predicting when the next information should come, and when you present the visual stimulus, it's actually orienting them to where they should be attending and encoding. I don't know, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I have, because when, for example, the task with the tones, you can also shift it in time. So in the original study, you use it with fixed durations from height and hertz. So you have and if it would be really unimpaired for the time dimension, well then that should be fine. But we just run it with in comparison to what I presented at the very beginning. But even on the time dimension, the music have a deficit. Not as strong, but it's there. What you call attention, well, impairment or deficit, I don't know. What I'm wondering in how far lots of this, what is important in the tasks that have been used in the material, whether it's verbal or non-verbal, or then even the help with the audiovisual binding or the boost of the audiovisual interaction, is it's the sequencing and then the regularity. So to predict, to encode, to store, and integrate the new one. And so what you want to do now is to put it in the visual domain, but with sequentiality. So you have to memorize visual information instead of having tone information going over time, and then see. Or either can we find also the serial item or that is order results that have been reported for the patient populations, and see the differences. So to go into the sequentiality, what might then tap into temporal attention. Or what would be interesting too, in line what we've said, is to compare more systematically regular and irregular presentation and seeing how far they show the same, well, difference when we have to see what is the baseline of its deficit or is it cost or best benefit, like for the controls. But for the controls, if you do a task like this and you do a temporarily irregular presentation, well, performance drops, obviously. And does it drop as much for the music as for the controls? So the other way around. So I fully agree. There's something else to be understood, the temporal dimension that then can affect the encoding of the other information.
I was wondering, do your participants know that they would have been classified as having amusia before doing the battery? And if so, do they know their whole lives? Do they not listen to music when they're younger? That kind of thing.
It's very varied. So initially I had the ambition to present other stuff, because I think we say congenital amusia, but even the discussion now has shown that there are different types. And if you extend it more to also other questionnaires that we have done, or we have done, can also distinguish not only different extent, but also different attitudes to music. Those who listen to music, others who avoid music. And to your question, do they come to the lab and they know about the deficit? I think we had so the general recruitment is what we imitated from what Isabel did or Laura Stewart did at the beginning, is you make announcements that, oh, has someone told you already you sing very badly, or do you don't recognize? And then people do a first test, and then you bring them in the lab if the performance is slow enough, and do the full battery and other tests and questionnaires in order to confirm or not whether they actually are music or classify for the definition. But not all of them. For example, we had one participant who came to the original study that was before we used it with the music, the tone material, tempo material, verbal material, short-term memory task. She just came to participate and gain some money, right? And she did the verbal part and was all fine, and then Katrin Schulze was, and she came out and I don't understand what you asked me. So Katrin explained again and again and again, and the girl went back and came out all red of concentration. I have no clue what you asked me. So she discovered that, so she really wanted to do the task, but it didn't mean anything to do the tone sequences and to find a difference or not. So Katrin said, oh wait, that's not music. And so we tested her, and she was very low in performance, and all questionnaires were really in the direction. And she didn't know about the phenomenon. So it's not as if and her performance pattern was like the other control music later on. So it's not a condition to know. Some people discover that there's something what they always consider as weird for themselves. And so when others say, oh, look at this music and it's so great, and don't recognize or don't have the pleasure to listen to it, rather turn off the audio radio, then and always wonder whether they are special and they are unique, and then discover that it's actually a phenomenon even rare, but it exists and others are like as comforting in some sense. What is interesting then for the outreach, because if also some of the witnesses of the music is very touching when they say, well, when I was young, the teacher at school yelled at me and sent me out of the classroom because thinking I'm making fun of him. So it's also interesting that the teachers know that the phenomenon exists and it's not only meaning that want to destroy the teacher.
Yeah, Ashu?
Thank you very much for your talk. That was very nice. I have two questions. So one, it really struck me to know that during the short-term memory encoded task, that there was a deficit in backward connectivity when they're encoding the sound, and that to me sounded a little bit like sort of similar to Laurel's point about attention, the deficit in attention recruitment to the temporal area from the temporal area to attend to the sound. So I was wondering if it was possible to stimulate a music brain to behave as like the normal control population, because you mentioned that it's possible to do it the other way around, to the TDCS stimulate the control population to behave as a music population.
Yeah, that was the one study I briefly mentioned, but Isabel Perez did in Royal, where they decrease the performance of the control with the TCS simulation in over the frontal areas.
So is it possible to increase the?
To increase the other way around, to
Yeah.
make the music better. Yeah, that's what the Schal did with their study. It's not my work, so there are two different studies. We only observed the region, the fMRI study, and then for the oscillation in the MEG study. And based on this, Schal et al., the German group, they stimulated the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex in their musics and improved their performance. So that's in one direction. And the Montreal group, they used the normal participants and made them less normal or more music-like.
Interesting.
So you could look at both things.
That actually touches on my second question I had, which was on the point of DOPSC. In the so decreased DOPSC activity in the music population, and I was wondering if there was any supportable effect in the music population, if there's any effect in DOPSC, like for example, perhaps less rewarded musical processing, less rewarded pitch processing in the music population, or is it just not there?
So there's another phenomenon that is the musical anhedonia. Rodriguez Cornell, also Robert Sartori did stuff, Laura Ferrari, they worked on this. So that's now a definition too. So the Barcelona Music Reward Questionnaire and Absorption edition recently, that they used to define the people who can be musical anhedonic. So they don't have an anhedonia for other material, but more specifically to the music material. And there you can have the separation between being anhedonic but not on music. So they perform well on the perception task, but once it kicks into the reward dimension, they classify it.
Oh, so it's sort of a separate kind of interesting. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So maybe one last question, Erica.
Yeah, actually, I feel like my question relates to both the last two questions, which I was curious of, like, I'm not super familiar with this work, so I was just curious about the distinction between the musics who also really dislike listening to music versus those that like listening to music but just have the perceptual deficits. Because like at the end you said that liking can increase performance. So I was just wondering if the previous studies had separated those like subtypes of amusia, or if you just don't have the population to be able to do that.
For the neurocorrelates, no. We don't have. We then looked at it when we asked more specifically to emotion processing. So having musical excerpts where they have to categorize the emotions and then judge the intensity of the emotion, or then have emotion perception and verbal material, or now also with this two-phase, what can be called for a long-term memory task with the liking, where then we start to make the link with the subjective reports. How much do they like music or listen to music in their everyday? But yeah, that's part of the, where I said it's congenital amusias, right? That's the different types, and that we have to see how the different constellations go together. Lawrence Stewart some time ago did interesting questionnaire studies, or then these everyday life probing, do you listen to music now, and just described also the different categories, what subtypes, categories is this from. Some avoid, or some actually like and listen and report, and now it will be interesting to see how does it have the effect, or then also trying to, what you said, attention or potential temporal shocking. So lots for men to be done, but it's they're not so easy to find, so you can't have big groups with all different subtypes, but we're getting there.
Okay, well, I want to thank you again, Barbara, and there's a wine and cheese, so hope to see you all there in a minute.